Nicholas Roerich was a Russian artist born in 1874 who had a very successful career in Russia before leaving after the revolution. He came to the West, to America, where he had exhibitions of his paintings that traveled all over the country. And while he was here, he established the schools that he had always dreamed of having. One of the great ideals of that time was that beauty would save the world, that the creative people in the world had the responsibility to save the world. And for that purpose, it was necessary for creative people in the different disciplines to come together and to know each other. So he established schools of all the arts. It was all very successful in its time in the 1920s. But here he found the support for his spiritual explorations, his travels to the Far East, where he also produced many hundreds of paintings. But in addition, did a lot of what could be called spiritual, esoteric exploration. In the same way, it's important to remember that Nicholas Roerich was also what could be called a peace activist. He really was, that was a focus of his life, the finding ways to, on the one hand, enhance the possibilities for peace in the world, which he saw as a natural result of increasing cultural appreciation and cultural values in the world. And he also fought very hard for the preservation of the cultural heritage of humanity, because humanity has a tendency to destroy the best products of its most creative impulses. And Roerich established a treaty, an international treaty, for the protection of the cultural heritage of people. The treaty was first promoted by Roerich while he was still in Russia, but it didn't become anything actual or practicable until the Roerich Pact of 1935, which was signed in Washington by all the Pan-American nations, and then other nations joined. By that treaty, nations were committed to protect the cultural institutions and activities of their nations. The World War II came along, and it took the steam out of all of that effort. But after World War II, there was then the Bruges Convention of 1953, which continued that tradition. And that's maybe now the most important of such treaties. Roerich created this symbol that so many people know of, the red circle with the 3 dots, the Trinitarian symbol for culture, that could be flown outside of institutions or even painted on a roof of an institution in order to protect it from bombardments or other destructions during war. Of course, the technology of war has now made it so more horrific that you cannot paint a red cross on the roof of a hospital and thereby protect the hospital. When we wipe out whole cities in one evening. So the treaty has taken on more of a cultural peace significance rather than protecting individual institutions. Roerich, together with his wife, Helena, began developing their spiritual interests very early in Russia. In most of the capitals of the world in the 1890s, there was an enormous upsurge of interest in spirituality and in other religions. Interest in Buddhism was very high. Interest in Vedanta was very high. After the World Parliament of Religions in 1893, when Swami Vivekananda made such an impact and his books were published all over the world, that had an enormous effect also. In St. Petersburg, which was what would now seem to us to be a very small place, and certainly the educated, cultured classes were a very small group. There was a teacher named Uspensky who was very active, and I believe the Roerichs must have known him. In the first decade of the 20th century, in St. Petersburg, they built the first Buddhist temple in the West, and Nicholas Roerich was involved in that. He designed parts of the temple, but also became very interested in Buddhism itself, especially Tibetan Buddhism. And Helena Roerich wrote in her letters that for them, Vivekananda and Ramakrishna were their first teachers, she said. That was in answer to a question about whether they were interested in theosophy and knew much about Blavatsky. Actually, they did not join the Theosophical Society until they left Russia. They joined when they were in London in 1919. So their interests grew rapidly and very personally, because they developed so quickly and so completely, which certainly would have reflected what we could call a many-life development over more than one lifetime. That in the 1920s, they began their own study groups, and which resulted ultimately in a complete body of work and a complete teaching called Agni Yoga, which is widespread today all over the world. Well, Agni Yoga, it's hard to put into words, actually, and it's a question that is always difficult to answer. Agni, of course, means fire in Sanskrit, and it's the creative and destructive element of all existence. The teaching itself is just a teaching for self-development, following on Eastern teachings and theosophical teachings. Well, maybe more than most other teachings, it's a teaching that stresses the need to use daily life and the world as the classroom and the laboratory in which one grows, so that one can study many spiritual principles, but then must immediately attempt to apply them in daily life, and only then, by doing that, can one learn and grow. I think that's fundamental to the teaching. Shambhala is everyone's dream of perfection, the unattainable perfection. In order to understand the idea of Shambhala, at least the way the Roerichs presented it, and the way Agni Yoga presents it, one has to understand the concept of hierarchy, of the spiritual hierarchy, of individuals who have evolved far beyond our own evolution, but who guide us and teach us, who remain with us and I can't say oversee us, but do what they can to help us to move in the right directions of our own spiritual and practical evolution. These teachers do teach to some few sensitive people who then present the teachings to the world. And the Roerichs were among that very select group of people. Shambhala is their abode, is their center, is their own focus of operation, and to the Roerichs it was a very physical place that has connections with with its counterparts, you might say, on the non-physical realms. It's a very old tradition, but like all old traditions, it has many variants over time and in different places. It develops many variants in concept. So there are people who believe that Shambhala has no physical reality and exists only in the spirit or in the heart. There are people who believe that Shambhala is an actual place, but not on a material plane. And there are people, as I said, like the Roerichs, who certainly presented the idea that Shambhala is both a very physical place and a very much on the subtle, what we call the subtle realms. Well, if all of your spiritual teachings come from that source, and if Shambhala is the guiding center for the evolution of the world, once you know about it, you cannot be uninterested in it. You would be vitally interested in it. And the Roerichs were designated, in a sense, were chosen by the teachers in Shambhala to be their representatives, to present the teachings, which in English is sometimes called the perennial philosophy, to present them in their own way to the world. So there is a series of books whose origins were in Shambhala. This series of books is read widely all over the world as an expression of a way to develop oneself, a way to evolve, and a way to understand the cosmological and evolutionary processes that control all of us. Well, it's hard to do that, actually, without getting into discussions about what is valid and what is invalid and what is true and what is not true. So all I can just say with authority is that we here consider our books to be quite valid and quite true, and leave the others to themselves. We revere theosophy. We revere the Kalachakra tradition. We revere the entire chain of Buddhist teachers and the idea of the chain of Buddhas, you might say, who come to enlighten humanity. And of course the one that we now wait for, the Maitreya Buddha, is all part of the teaching too.
I think there's two kinds of Shambhala or any kind of this kind of mystical land. There is one aspect of Shambhala, or a mystical land, is believed to be external world. If you really walk, travel with guides, with proper, with right preparations, you will get such places. But then, inner Shambhala, or ultimate Shambhala, is the realization of the true nature of the mind, realization of the Buddha presence, Buddha Pure Land in us, and so ultimate Shambhala, or ultimate Pure Land, is always in us, not somewhere else, but also there are teachings that tells about that kind of sacred lands on this earth, visible only for people who are ready, or when the time comes. So Shambhala can be both inside of us as well outside of us. Pure Land has two different kind of things. One is, according to Buddhism, Sambhogakaya Pure Land. That is real Buddhahood, Buddha Pure Land. That is, if you become a Buddha, then you will be able to see, realize, and enjoy it. That Pure Land is a world of non-duality, never changing, ever ever existing, and that kind of Pure Land, the Buddha mind and Buddha Pure Land, the wisdom and the wisdom light, all are inseparable, so non-dual. That Pure Land is like a Sambhogakaya Pure Land. Then there are Nirmanakaya Pure Lands. Nirmanakaya Pure Lands are different kinds of, different qualities of Pure Land. For example, the Amitabha Pure Land is a beautiful, joyful world manifested by the power of the aspirations of the Buddha, Amitabha Buddha, Buddha of infinite light. But that Pure Land is still in a world of duality, dualistic concepts, world of emotions, but positive emotions, world of even hierarchies. There's a Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, devotees. But if you take rebirth there, then in one lifetime you will become enlightened. So there won't be negative emotions, there won't be sufferings, only peace and joy. However, it is still a dualistic world, still a emotional, positive emotional world. And so this kind of Pure Land is Nirmanakaya Pure Land, not Sambhogakaya Pure Land, manifested Pure Land. And if you take rebirth there, then it is easier to take a rebirth there than becoming Buddha. And if we take rebirth there, then we will become enlightened in lifetime, because we will never do any negative things but only positive things, and we will progress our enlightened journey.
So it's a very, very important tantra, and it is given by Buddha to the Shambhala kings, and ever since then the Shambhala kings all through the royal hereditary line of the kings will practice this and giving teachings, and it is a very special, because generally it's a very high tantra through the practice of this that one can eventually attain the full enlightenment. And particularly in this degenerated time when people have so much defilements and conflicts and all kind of problems. So in this degenerated time, the Kala Chakra is very, very important, because it is an antidote for this kind of degenerated time, so that if we practice this, through this practice, that we can overcome all the problems and the sufferings that we encounter. The peace have to come from the individuals. First, we have to create the peaceful mind within ourselves, and through this, then we will also create the peace through our neighbors, through our local communities, and then to the villages and cities, and eventually to the whole world. So by bestowing the Kala Chakra initiation, that people become more tamed, our mind is more tamed, and we realize that negative emotions are the source of all the sufferings, and the positive qualities like loving kindness and compassion are beneficial not only for oneself but for everybody. So by practice, more and more people will practice loving kindness and compassion, and then the world peace will prevail. All teachings are same, but particularly the Kala Chakra, because it is said that according to the history, that in the degenerated time, the many wrong views and many wrong activities will prevail throughout the world. And this will cause a lot of misery and a lot of sufferings. And then eventually, you see, the Shambhala kingdom is ruled by the kings. And every king is enthroned on the throne for 100 years, giving Kala Chakra teachings and practicing. And so at the moment, it is the 21st king, and then the 22nd, 23rd, 24th, 25th king, who is the wrathful one. And so during his time, then almost the whole world is filled with this kind of barbaric activities. And so then he will come as a warrior, as a great hero, and then destroy all the wrong actions, wrongdoings, and again turn the wheel of Dharma. And at that time, so many people will be able to attain the realization. And so therefore, Kala Chakra is particularly at this moment, at this time, it is important. The Shambhala kingdom is also not something that anybody can see it directly, but the people who have the great merits and the fortune can go there. There are stories, many great masters, without leaving their physical body, have traveled to Shambhala and then come back also. There are Shambhala guidebooks and so on. Initiations are always given in Shambhala. I was told that in the Shambhala palace, the king's palace has a garden, and in the garden there is a mandala, Kalachakra mandala, which is created out of emanations created mandala. So in there the initiations are given always. And during this time that we receive Kalachakra, and then we make the connection, we plant the seed, and then later when the 25th king will come into this part of the world and destroys all the wrongdoings, wrong actions, wrong views, and at that time, due to this seed, that at least if one have not got the realization before, but at least at that time, everyone who received the Kalachakra initiations can then meet the king and go through. I mean, the Shambhala kings are actually very highly realized great bodhisattvas. So they can emanate, they can send emanations in whichever form, wherever necessary, whenever it is required, in peaceful form, wrathful form, all kind of forms, so they can do anything.
There's one truth. There are many ways of expressing the truth. So of course there are common points. And the tragic thing in human history is that the variants of the one truth use different language and different names. And people have been killing each other over thousands of years about the differences in terminology even, where the underlying truths are always the same. So yes, of course there are common points. Nicholas Roerich made his point about that by making paintings honoring the founders of the great world religions, because they were all expressions of one fundamental truth. You say, look for Shambhala. Yeah, it's interesting. It's just what people say. But it seems to me that if I were in touch with Shambhala, and I was actually, in a sense, having discussions with representatives of Shambhala, and we were on an intimate relationship, I would not have to look for Shambhala. I would just go there on invitation, yes, and I would expect that they would give me the directions, yes. So I wouldn't have to look for it. It is said that on Roerich's expeditions, they did visit either Shambhala or outposts of Shambhala, or whatever one wants to think of it as. There are certainly no road maps available. But of course the expedition had many purposes beyond that. But that certainly was a purpose, yes. Roerich's life was so filled with adventure and experiences that could be mythologized and romanticized that it's often hard to know what actually happened and what did not happen. But during the expedition, which was his major expedition, he also had others, they spent the summer of 1927 in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia, and then set out to go south through the Gobi Desert all the way to Tibet. And part of the way in the Gobi Desert, there is a range of mountains called Tangla near the Tsaidam marshes, and the expedition did stop there for, I believe, a couple of weeks. And the Roerichs built a big stupa, which is quite unusual, really. But there are photographs of it. They did do that. And lamas came from everywhere. I don't know, here in the middle of the desert, they just suddenly were there. And they made contacts with the Roerichs, and there are photographs of them circumambulating the stupa. At that time, it's said that the Roerichs, meaning Nicholas Roerich, Helena Roerich, and their older son George Yuri Roerich, disappeared into those very white mountains called the Tangla Mountains, and which Roerich painted a number of times, and reappeared only a few days later. It's said by a number of people, and has been told to me from varying sources that have no connection with each other, that those are very sacred mountains that have caves in them that are what one person called initiatory caves, and that the Roerichs were summoned there for some high purpose, some ritualistic purpose perhaps. And Roerich made paintings that seem to depict that. So it could very well have all happened. Well, again, in the history of all of this, the stone is a very important thing. Helena Roerich wrote extensively about the stone and its role in the world. It's a stone that is held, you might say, by individuals at a time when they are supposed to exert great influence in the spiritual development of the world. When the Roerichs left America to go to the Far East in 1923, when they were in Paris, this stone was delivered to them. It had been in the care, I have heard, of a French secret society, and their mission was to return the stone to Shambhala. The story is that it's a meteoritic stone. The legend is that its original source is Orion, the constellation of Orion. I don't know how that's physically possible, but that's part of the legend. So maybe this visit to these caves in Tangla were part of that mission. I don't know. There's a lot of mystery always to mythology and to legends, and that's why we're always so intrigued by them. Well, it's made clear in the literature that one cannot just go because one wants to go. One can, I don't know if one can ever choose to go. The idea that one must be summoned or invited is perhaps a better way to look at it. I don't really know. But in the literature there is this call that Roerich wrote a number of times, the call of Shambhala, calling one to, summoning one to come is kalagiya. He said, when you hear kalagiya, you know you are ready. I've known people who have tried to find it, have tried to go there, have searched through all the literature looking for maps. There is a famous writing by someone I think named Grunvedel from the 19th century called The Path to Shambhala, and people have used that as a guide and often been lost forever. It's hard to know. But the Roerichs, as I said, Roerich in his paintings did, in a way, confirm that they did visit that place. Well, we have to. It was easy for me to accept the concept because even when I was young, I found it hard to believe that I represented the peak of evolution. It seems somehow arrogant. And maybe everything that exists thinks of itself as the peak of evolution because it does not understand anything that is more evolved than it is. Maybe the worm on the sidewalk thinks of itself as the peak of evolution, and when it sees me coming toward it on the street, it doesn't know what I am because it can't conceive of it. It thinks it's the ultimate. So maybe humanity thinks it's the ultimate when it's not, because it cannot recognize whatever is more evolved than it is. And that seems quite evident to me. So I always was quite willing to accept that there are people, beings, entities, individualities in the world that are far more evolved than I am. And there again, when you become more evolved, it seems that the concept is that you become, in a way, more liberated from your physical being. You can detach yourself from your physical being and have a separate existence even. So there are these people, individuals who were once people like us, who have evolved far beyond what we are, what you and I are. And because of that highly advanced state of evolution, they are better equipped to understand the processes in which we get so enmeshed than we do. And they can teach us about them and help us guide ourselves through the solutions of our own problems and somehow continue to evolve ourselves. There is in some schools of Buddhism the idea of what's called the Bodhisattva vow, that when these people reach a certain level of evolution, they are free to move on, to leave the earth, but they, in a kind of self-sacrificing way, choose to stay here to pull us all up to their level. If you believe that, then that puts an enormous responsibility on you, because you and I are holding them back by not growing fast enough. So there is a kind of interchange of responsibility there that's really very interesting. Well, I don't know. That's not part of anything I learned. I mean, that if you're part of this hierarchy of masters, you have all come out of the human pool. The non-human ones are like angels, and I don't know anything about them. They're nice to think about, but I don't know about them. Someone who knew enough to be able to guide me, to help me along, to be a spokesperson for all those ideals and concepts that are important for me. Also a person who, in his own life, had such focus and such energy and such discipline and such adventurousness that I sometimes feel a little shame that I cannot be equal to all of that. But still, it's like any magnet that draws you further beyond what you yourself are. He is like that.
I think the world today, of course, has a lot of problems, but basically hope for the best, and we hope that people will learn through our past mistakes, in the past, during the last century, there was so much war and so much conflict and so on, which create a lot of pains and sufferings. And so, nobody wants sufferings. Everybody wants happiness. And so, therefore, now with the world is developing, technology, science, education, and especially the communications, more and more people can understand each other more and more. In the past, we don't know the Westerners, what they're doing, and Westerners don't know what Tibetans are doing, and so on. But now the world has become small. We know exactly what is doing everybody's life. So through these close connections, that we can make a better world. And we can learn from each other, and we can create a very strong loving kindness and friendship, so that we can make a better world, a more peaceful, more happier, more harmonious world. you.